Here we go. Let's go while we're happy. Yeah, there we go. Hey, Dan.
Hey, Chris.
On to the next one. I'm excited about this as well. What are we showing me? What are we showing me? What are you showing me?
We are covering materials, at least from what I think MoGraph people will care about. We're going to do a high level at different materials that Unreal offers and some pros and cons.
Yeah. Some of these things have been the hurdle I can't get over with Unreal. So I'm excited to find out more as this keeps getting better with Lumen, I know. And yeah. So before we get going, do all the social media stuff for us. Like, subscribe, hit that bell, whatever the kids are saying. I don't
It
know.
helps us. Thank you.
Yes. Amen. Cheers to that. And then check out our Patreon in the description below. We're exploring that and expanding that out as we get going. So, Dan, take it away.
All right, let's dig in. So, first example you see is our shameless plug. No, I'm just kidding. So what we're going to cover today is a bunch of materials of at least the ones that I use, a few that I don't, but I can see some possibilities too. And there's a lot of other ones that really dig into. I haven't found a need, especially people that care more about kind of like high-end rendering and using Unreal as a render engine and sequencer, or just I guess more physically accurate stuff. These are the ones that we're going to cover. So this is our custom material. I'll come back to this one at the end just to showcase you guys, but we've been kind of doing some exploration with pattern work and then mixing physically based materials into some of these to get some fun effects. And we've been using this in our work. I've enjoyed using these immensely. So we'll kind of come back to it later, which leads us into the next one. So this one isn't necessarily a shader type, but it is a good note of anyone who's interested is the Megascans library. So anyone who is ever interested, you can open it up in here. And Megascans, you have access to the bridge. And as long as you're doing work inside Unreal and you're using your Epic Games account, this stuff is all free, which is very helpful. It's built in the browser. It's super easy to use. I love using this stuff. And that's kind of some of the inspiration we had. If you have access to these, mixing some of these in artful ways, it just makes a lot of fun for art direction, and it gives you a lot of polish and quality to your renders. So I won't spend time digging through this material, but it's just a good note to call out. This is a resource that's available.
So good. Everything you just said too was free, as long Epic Games account, Unreal, all that.
That's not free.
Well,
but
yeah,
the rest is free.
yeah,
But it's cheap, and cheap is good. So yeah, okay. So we'll dig in. So we have Opaque, plain vanilla, good old Opaque. So I have material instances set up with this. I'm going to show you both the instance and the material, and I'm going to do my best to frame this up well for you guys. So I've got this guy set up, the standard physically based material. I don't have any textures in here. I'm not using any texture maps, which you could, but it's metal, specular, which I probably should just delete. To me, I use specular as kind of like controlling the amount of reflection. It's probably not physically based at that point. I use it as a hack. And then roughness, anisotropy, which is okay, but if you want to get some stretching of your metallic material, it's there, and emissive colors. So this is the base material that I've got and the material instance that I'm using here. So just a quick demo so you can see what this is. You can see if I set this to 1, we've got this set to metal. I crank this guy up. I've got this set to a chrome. I can kind of, well, 3 is over, but it's all the same. I set this down to 0. We're now just into what would be more like a plastic, very shiny, very smooth. Let's see, turn that guy off. So you can kind of see how some of these work. Make it a little darker so we can see it. Roughness, like I said, just a basic material. When I would do stuff in Redshift, I would set up most materials like this. Pretty quick and pretty clean. Specular, like I said, this is kind of a reflection amount. I don't think it falls into the PBR workflow, but it's an option, and I use it here. And then, of course, one of my favorites, make it glow. So with Lumen and emissive, it's shiny. So The one thing I've liked since they've added lumen is emissive materials will actually cast light out into your global illumination. When I started learning how to light stuff with Octane, I relied on this heavily. I still enjoy this, but as you can see, this kicks out light. Not every material does that. So kick that back out and on to the next. Masked material. And I'll show you on this one where these actually fall. So mask is a version of translucency. You can see with these ones, they have translucency, but it's only 0 or 1. It's on or it's off. You get a hard cut and you can control this. So I found a number of ways when animating stuff, this can be very useful, but you don't get that blend. So that's kind of the one downside to it. And you probably would ask, why are all of these things built this way? And really, because Unreal is a game engine, a lot of these materials were built and optimized workflows to work in games at real-time frame rates. But since they've added lumen and ray tracing, we get all this better lighting. So there's kind of just different effects and stuff we have to work with off of an older, built material. So I'm going to show you guys where this is located, since that's probably important. We have the material domain. It's a surface. I'm not really digging into light functions, deferred decals. You can download decals off Megascans and throw them on there, but we're not going to really dig into much of these today. The blend mode is the big one. So we just covered opaque. This is mask. Translucent is next. I've got additive, modulate. I don't remember if I did that one. We'll see if that one's coming up. And then alpha holdout in some of these. I don't ever use basically any of these 4. The top 3 are the ones that I use the most. And then default lit. I haven't really dealt much with cloth or clear coat, or I have clear coat in here, but some of these other ones. Unlit is great if I'm doing like interface work. If I want something to just look like a Pantone color or a solid color and I don't want it to accept light or shading, Unlit is helpful for that. But I keep everything in default lit most of the time. And then the last big one, well, it is 2, but two-sided is a big one. So kind of elaborating on what this does, because Unreal historically, when you want something to run in real time, you need this to be optimized frame rate. So your polygon normals on your object need to be facing out. So any normals that the camera can see, it will render. When you turn this off, it's only going to render one side of this. So if I reapply this, anything that you see in the back is now transparent. And when you're working in Cinema 4D, you can come up here, you can go to options, backface culling. And nothing's going to change here because all of my normals are looking pretty good. And you can check that by selecting all of them. So you can see that they're orange. And now I have backface culling going on. When I go through, it's now translucent. So this is how Unreal renders, is it's like backface culling. It does this by default. And if I turn this off, now I can see the back sides of all of my normals. Why should I care, you ask?
Such a good teacher, Dan.
No,
that was one that got me and got so many people coming into Unreal. It's like, where did everything go? Oh, my normals were backwards.
Yeah, and that's a fun thing to figure out, is like getting your normals accurate. Like I've processed so many things, especially vehicles. You get crap models and they're backwards, and it's like, oh man, like it's an art form just processing normals. So right now, this system is only rendering what it can see. When I do two-sided and I apply this, magically, I can see the back, and all this is now rendering, which is great. The downside with this is if you're trying to be conscious about your frame rates, it's rendering every polygon twice. It's rendering the front and the back. With graphics cards getting as strong as they are, it doesn't seem to matter as much to me, but just kind of something worth covering. That is kind of a big thing, and that plays into transparency across the board.
Are you moving forward? I had a question about that one.
Ask away.
What's going on? Because I don't think of materials as masked, I guess. So this is like interacting like a Boolean would or something in Cinema.
It's more like an alpha map. So if you, a lot of this stuff, for whatever reason, I think of more in terms of After Effects. I think of this more as like a Lumimat.
Yeah.
That's animating across, but it's like in texture space. But yeah, I mean, it looks like a Boolean, but it's not actually cutting or affecting any of the geometry. It's all in like texture or material space.
So does that have depth, and what's happening with where it's being cut? Like in a bool, it would be, there'd be no geometry there, and you'd see the, like you just talked about, the front and the back of the, well, yeah. What's the answer?
So none of this geometry. If I go to lit, check wireframe mode. Okay, so you can see when I switch to this mode, all the geometry is still there. So a true Boolean is actually going to be cutting the geometry and kind of rebuilding it and doing it. This is, like I said, it's more like an alpha matte or mask that you would use in After Effects to control your transparency, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's cool. Cool.
Okay. Yeah. So now I can like offset this in here. And the nice thing is you can see is this actually does interact with the shadowing. And I think because it's two-sided, the lighting's affected with both. But some of these things are just, you can have fun playing with them. There's all sorts of fun things you can do with it. All right. On to the next one. So translucency. This is probably one of the biggest areas where Unreal struggles when you compare this to an offline render like Redshift or Octane. Because a lot of it before ray tracing, like you don't get refraction. Caustics are still very experimental. This is probably one of the biggest downsides that you're going to run into when you get into Unreal is glass transparency. If you rely on this heavily in your work, this will probably be one of your biggest hurdles. But there are some good tutorials out there and some stuff that I will show you. But with ray tracing, which I have an RTX card on my laptop and in my system, so I can flick on ray tracing. So for an example, post-process volume. In this scene, I am rendering my reflections in Lumen and my GI in Lumen. If I'm doing stuff with like vehicles or cars or a lot of hard surface reflections, I set my reflections almost always to ray tracing. They do a lot cleaner. If I'm doing more natural environments and stuff like that, Lumen does a pretty good job and it's pretty fast. Let's see. So the last thing in here is I've got translucency set to ray tracing. So if I set this to raster, this historically is how a real-time engine is going to render transparency. So it's trying to attempt to simulate volume, but this isn't really usable. This is a raster effect, but with ray tracing, I can go in and dial in some of the settings. And like I said, there's tutorials out there that will tell you kind of what settings to use. I will just simulate this quickly in this material. So this is the material I've got. I set up my parameters. So I have opacity into my opacity, which makes sense. IOR into refraction. So I'm using my index of refraction to control this, and then base color and emissive color. I made a note in here. If you're doing renders in sequencer, this will be a little side note. Opacity is one thing that by default it renders after the depth buffer. So you'll be rendering something with shallow depth of field. It looks all nice, and then everything that's transparent renders as just hard. So one thing I have to type on is DOF for depth of field. It starts by default as after. So it renders the depth of field and then it renders this translucency afterwards. So it's not getting calculated into the depth of field. If you switch this to before, magically everything falls in the way you want. So if you're making a window or a vase or something like that and you want it to have shallow depth of field, you got to do that. Back into this. If I set this down to 1, you can see this is kind of like your base translucency. And since we have ray tracing on, I can go through and start modifying this and cranking this thing up more and more to get more refraction. Back down, and I can also kind of scrub the opacity and whatnot. So like I said, it's not perfect, it's not amazing, but it's definitely making progress. And as I'm seeing updates with the path tracer coming, I feel like glass is getting there closer and closer.
Yeah, I wonder one thing too, with this being so thick, if that's making it look like garbage. It looks like a classic like marble block you put like stack for like the side of a shower, you know.
Yeah, this would basically be the equivalent of like if this thing is a solid piece of glass.
Not a marble, yeah, piece of glass,
pounds.
yeah.
But let's see, parameter overrides. If I took off two-sided, Let it compile the shader. So that's not rendering the back. I've played with it some. I don't have an example here, but like if you made this model and then you offset, like if you had a thin layer and another piece of glass on the other side, I think it starts to get more accurate when this isn't just a solid chunk of geometry. So if you made it thinner, it should render out better.
Yeah.
So that's that. Additive. Why do we care about additive? So this is not much to look at on its own. The one thing I found that this is useful is if you start getting into wanting to do rendering and simulation for like augmented reality work, if you're doing work on the HoloLens or something like that, and you want to kind of simulate to some degree how this is going to work, additive just adds on top of what it sees behind it. So I have my opacity and my 2 colors. I don't really use this one ever. I can see some uses of it, and you can see how this color adds, like, you know, like Dodge would in Photoshop. It kind of adds on top of it. So if you wanted to do work like that where you don't have shadows and light is additive, like I said, like a AR headset or an MR headset or whatever, this could have some uses. But in most day-to-day, I don't really use this at all. Alpha Composite. I don't use this one either. But I went through and added it in here just to show, like, here's something else that is potentially useful. It's a little more flat. It doesn't look great, but if you want something to look like a screen, bending light, it's not doing anything. From what I can tell, it's pretty efficient. It's just something you can throw in your toolbox, but, you know, yippee. Unlit. This one does not sound like it would be that useful, but if you ever just want something to be a solid color, so if you notice right now, the sunlight, the scene, like you can see there's specular light reflections on all of these. Unlit is exactly what it sounds like. It doesn't accept light. So if you want a material that is a complete blackout, it's just like a void. Like I'll do things to just omit for shadows and stuff like that. That can be very helpful. I'm going to dig into this, and I'm pretty sure this has the ability to cast light. So it makes light. Yeah, so this can affect the GI, but it doesn't accept anything outside of it. And it sounds like this would be something that's useless, but I find that this is useful a lot of the times. If you ever get into like, you know, UI UX stuff like interface design or more like graphic stuff that you want to appear more flat, this is constantly useful. I use this a ton when I want something to not have depth, which seems counterintuitive because that's kind of the whole point of the system, but they mix together.
That's great.
So last and not least, I haven't dealt with this one a lot, but Clear Coat I figured was worth mentioning. It's, as you can see, basically a PBR shader. So I threw in concrete, but like the other concrete, bear with me. So this guy has its own roughness material, and you can crank up the reflections on this and make it shiny, but the normal map is going to be mixing in with us. So you're going to get more of like a rough surface and stuff like that. So in the event I wanted to do like polished concrete in a warehouse that has a smooth coat, or you want to make your own car paint material where you have kind of like roughness and reflections under the surface, but then a glazed donut gloss over the top of it, that's where this one comes into play. So it's basically exactly what you would think. I don't use it a lot, especially with the Megascan stuff. A lot of this stuff is kind of covered, but it is something that you can play with, and I can see where there's some uses for it. And really, the last one on this list that we started with is just kind of showing you a little bit more of how this guy is built and how we use some of these stuff to mix in materials. So this guy, we've got our tileable textures in here, and then we've got PBR materials kind of piping into all of this that we can control and modify and do, kind of whatever, playing with this stuff. So we got a whole library of these. If you're interested and it's something you think would be helpful, we've got this fabric, leather, and steel or gold that we're mixing in. But I have a lot of fun of these doing with stylized work. So, if you're interested, we'll have links below. You can kind of check out some of these in the Epic Games Store. They plug in, they play. Yippee-ki-yay.
Wow, that was beautiful. I have to write that one down. Yeah, thanks, Dan. Thanks for showing us all that. I know there's a lot to explore there. I know there's actually some others that are going to come down the road as we're exploring. Feel free to make comments below. Actually, we highly encourage making comments below just to start a dialogue and ask and answer questions, make things better. Like, subscribe, push things forward. Check out our Patreon. Also, the link to our custom material packs that we have up on Unreal Marketplace. Maybe if you hit us up, we could even slip you a little sample or something. I don't know. Well, we didn't even talked about that, but yeah. Anyway, I'll probably circle that back. All right.
No.
Until next time. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.